Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Pratik and I'll be taking up the News Today discussion for 28th April. So let us take a look into the main news first. So in the first news, we will discuss the landmark India-New Zealand FTA agreement. The second news is about a report released by Niti Aayog, that is DPI or Digital Public Infrastructure Act 2047 report. Third news is with respect to inland waterways, which serve as an active instruments of growth. And the fourth news is about multilateralism in climate action. And then we also have certain quick updates. So let us start with the very first news, that is the India-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement have recently been signed. And this topic, of course, is part of GS Paper 2 International Relations. And this is very significant because of number of reasons. First reason is because of the kind of negotiation time was very less. Okay, so the discussion started in March 2025 and it was concluded in December 2025. So around roughly 8 to 9 months were taken for this discussion. So this basically signifies a large political consensus for this free trade agreement. The second important significance with respect to this FTA is that this is in line with India's vision of becoming a Viksit Bharat by 2047, because this particular agreement is going to integrate India in the global value chain, and it is going to empower the medium, small, and micro enterprises, women, and farmers, etc. So this is going to have tremendous impact. At the same time, India has managed to protect its sensitive sectors and sensitive areas from the competition, right? So this again is a very good example of balancing the protectionism as well as incorporating or embracing free trade agreement, right? So in this context, let us take a look into some of the major areas of the FTA. So from the side of New Zealand, New Zealand is providing us 100% duty-free access, which basically means that all the Indian products will go without any tariff to the New Zealand territory, which means that this is going to have a tremendous impact on the Indian exports. And particularly, this will be benefiting the labor-intensive sectors of India, such as MSMEs, textiles, leather, footwear, and gems and jewelry. Again, a second order effect of this will that it will create a lot of employment because these sectors require a lot of manpower. The second aspect is with respect to investment, and as per the part of this FTA, New Zealand has committed to US $20 billion investment in India over a period of 15 years. So again, this decision has been hailed across by various commerce groups in the country, because this investment is going to boost India's infrastructure and it is going to have a tremendous impact on the Indian productivity overall. Thirdly, India has maintained to protect its sensitive sectors, where India has offered the market access to the New Zealand exporters in 70% of the tariff lines, which covers around 95% of New Zealand's bilateral ties. Now, 30% of the tariffs are in the exclusion category, which means that they are not going to be covered within this FTA. And the purpose within this is to ensure that our farmers, particularly the small and marginal farmers, the domestic industries, are also given certain chance to compete fairly. Then we are also protecting the dairy sector, the sugar sector, vegetable products like onions, aluminium, etc. Moreover, we are also going with current benefit sharing, or in the future, if any sort of freeway or any sort of leverage is given to any other country, that will also be extended to New Zealand. So in a way, this exclusion of certain territory is essentially part of India's strategy of not exposing Indian vulnerabilities or Indian sensitive sector from the rigors of the competition. But at the same time, India has committed that in future, if it provides or opens up this sector to any other country, New Zealand will also be privy to that. Now, this is about the trade agreement, but this is not just limited to trade and investment. It also covers areas such as rules of origin. So what is rules of origin? So understand it like this. So if India and New Zealand has, say, a tariff of 5%, right? But India has tariff for countries like China as, say, 10%. So if China directs New Zealand or uses New Zealand as a base to send product to India, that would be effectively China using New Zealand as a part of its whole value chain to send products to India. So it is very essential that we have a very rigorous analysis of the rules of origin so that different countries cannot take advantage of this. Okay. So this is a robust framework of product specific rules of origin, PSRs, are going to be established, and this is to effectively prevent misuse of the trade benefit, so that in the garb of this FTA other country may not use this. And now this is very important because India is not part of RCEP, okay, and China is part of RCEP. So China and New Zealand in a way have an FTA, right? So China can send its product to New Zealand at a very low rate, or in a way very zero kind of rate or tariff. Now this can be diverted back to India. To protect that from happening, this rule of origin has been made very stringent. Then apart from this, we have also managed to ensure that our services sector are taken into consideration within this FTA. So in a way, it would be not correct to call this an FTA because it has an element of comprehensive economic partnership agreement, because apart from the goods, we have also taken into consideration the labor mobility and also about the student, right? So we have the student mobility post study visa for the STEM graduate, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics graduates, and the skilled professionals. We have decided to take an annual quota of 5,000 temporary employment visa for the skilled Indians. Then at the same time, we have also made sure that we are globalizing Ayush. That is the first time provision by New Zealand to recognize and facilitate trade in India's traditional medicine system, including Ayurveda and yoga. Now, this particular development has going to be a far-reaching implication because India and Oman has recently also incorporated Ayush as part of the FTA. So again, you can see here that India has been able to take more of its concern as part of the FTA. Then other areas in terms of agricultural productivity partnership, market across access over 118 service sector with most favored nation treatment in 139 sector. So again, all of these developments, we can see here that clearly most of India's national interest, India's sensitivities have been taken care of. So again, this trade agreement also is very significant because it is coming in the light of several geopolitical turbulences and the fact that India wants to diversify its trade agreement with different countries, right? So this development can be looked into this whole geopolitical realignment as well. Now let us take a look into the broader India-New Zealand relation in brief, right? So first is in terms of the market share, New Zealand is India's second largest trading partner in Oceania region. Now, obviously, the first trading partner is Australia, with which India almost have around $12 billion worth of trade. And recently, we also had a free trade, precursor to a free trade agreement with Australia. And it is said that with this FTA or the precursor to FTA, the total bilateral trade is going to go above or around $30 billion. The second aspect is in terms of trade volume. The bilateral merchandise has grown by around 50% to reach USD 1.3 billion in 2024-25. And more importantly, the trade is balanced in India's favor, which means that India's exports are more compared to what India imports from New Zealand. So Indian exports more to New Zealand than it imports. And in terms of diaspora, so this essentially means that not only we have a robust trade ties, we also have a very thriving people-to-people ties because we have around 3 lakh diaspora present in New Zealand, which is approximately 5% of New Zealand's population, acting as a cultural and economic bridge. At the same time, we are also going to have some sort of security relation, defense relation, and New Zealand is also part of India's vision of Indo-Pacific. Okay, so because of these reasons, New Zealand becomes a very important player for India's foreign policy, and this development or this conclusion of FTA signifies an important milestone in this journey. Let us now start with the second news, that is Digital Public Infrastructure at 2047 report has been released by Niti Aayog. Now, this topic can be part of GS paper 2, where we have to study governance, particularly e-governance. Within e-governance, we have to study applications, models, successes, limitations, potential. So this would be part of the potential of e-governance in India. Then it can also be part of GS paper 3 economy, where we need to study infrastructure. And this is a different sort of infrastructure, that is digital infrastructure. Now, first, let's understand the meaning of the term digital public infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we generally think of roads, rails, etc. Now, what exactly is the purpose of infrastructure? The purpose of infrastructure is not to directly create prosperity, but they act as a bridge, they act as enablers. Similarly, digital infrastructure are digital enablers. For example, through Aadhaar, it becomes easy for the government to identify the beneficiaries. Through direct benefit transfer, government can provide beneficiary with the kind of subsidies that is required. So in a way, the digital public infrastructure is a very important component of India's development strategy. But as per Niti Aayog report, now we need to go beyond it. We need to look into what is called as DPI 2.0 and DPI 3.0. So let us look into what exactly are these three things. So first of all, DPI 2.0, as of now, we have been following what is called as DPI 1.0. So DPI 1.0 is simply government providing services using the digital infrastructure. For example, Aadhaar. And also we can consider UPI, where some other applications have been built, but the common infrastructure is provided by the government, right? So that is your DPI 1.0. Then there are two phases of DPIs, that is DPI 2.0, that will be running from 2025 to 2035 for 10 years. And the next phase of DPI, that is DPI 3.0, will be running from 2035 to 2047. And the whole approach here is, if you look at the report, there's an executive summary, and then different members of Niti Aayog has talked about the objectives of this approach. And all of them has linked this objective with that of Viksit Bharat goal by 2047, under which we want to make Indian economy a 30 trillion economy, and we want to raise the per capita income to $18,000. Now let us take a look into what exactly are the components within DPI 2.0 and within DPI 3.0. So DPI 2.0 essentially is about creating prosperity, okay? So DPI 1.0 is about government-led infrastructure. Here you can consider is government to citizen. Okay, so basically the idea is to provide welfare function. To provide welfare function, or to provide or reduce poverty, etc. Right? The second version, but again, if India wants to be a developed country, then government alone cannot do the entire work. The private sector have to be roped up. So for that, government needs to create incentives. And here, DPI 2.0 comes into picture. Now, DPI 2.0 will be acting as an enabler. And here, this will lead to the small and marginal enterprises to utilize digital technologies for their various usage, for loans, for micro loans, for certain AI-enabled services, etc. And then in the DPI 3.0, it will be a transformative approach where everything will be together, and DPI 3.0 will be largely about transformation, where mostly it will be B2C, B2B, etc. development. And it will be building on the previous infrastructure that have been constructed under DPI 1.0, DPI 2.0, and DPI 3.0. In simple words, DPI 1.0 is to ensure that poverty is undertaken or poverty is uh, alleviated. DPI 2.0 is to ensure that there is some sort of enabler in terms of wealth generation, right? And third is about transformation in a non-linear way. DPI 3.0 is about creation of wealth in terms of development, higher level development. Now, what are the various components of or the key drivers of DPI 2.0? So first, it consists of 8 sectors. What are these 8 sectors? There is MSMEs, agriculture, energy, finance, education, health, social protection. So these 8 sectors have been covered under DPI 2.0. The idea is that we cannot cover everything all at once. So we need to go by certain areas which are very critical for the growth and development of the country. That is why initially 8 sectors have been identified as part of India's development requirements. The second thing is, what are the ways through which execution will be done? First is, it will not be technology oriented, but it will be demand oriented. Now, what it means is that earlier, technology would be developed and then it would be seen where that technology could be utilized. But now the Niti Aayog report has flipped this equation and had said that we will be identifying the demand first, and based on the demand, we will be aggregating that demand. Once we get different types of demand, then we will scale that demand and we will create entrepreneurship. For example, if there is a demand for, say, some sort of fertilizer requirement by the farmers, right? So this can be aggregated in such a way that an entrepreneurship can be sustained on the basis of providing the suitable kind of fertilizer for the farmer in a certain area, right? Then for that, AI will be used. Now entrepreneurship will be scaling things, but generally we utilize services at an individual level, which basically means that different people have different requirement, and it is possible that those people who are utilizing technology may not know the language in which the information is provided. So here comes the utility of AI, because AI can help in customization, in personalization, and it can also help those farmers who do not know any major languages, right? So they can just interact with the AI system and then can get certain help, right? Then once this is done, then the data can be used in cross-sectoral strategic unlocks. For example, agriculture with water development, sanitation with water development, or something else. So the idea is that we need to look into some creative way of interlinking different things. For example, we have agriculture, energy. So energy can be transformed into health. Health can be translated into education. So depending on all such requirement, we get a feeling or get an idea of how this can be utilized in a more scalar manner. Then what are the key recommendations of Niti Aayog regarding this? So first is that there should be decentralized state level execution, which means that state cannot take a centralized approach towards this DPI 2.0. It has to be decentralized one, which means that the government should promote the local level kind of needs, etc. Right? And then the focus has to be on the MSME and agriculture. Why MSME? Because they provide a lot of jobs, because they're job intensive. Second, they are also very useful for exports, as we have recently said or discussed about India New Zealand FTA. So MSME also creates jobs and they also help in exports. Plus agriculture is good for or important for food and nutritional security, and it is also very vital for providing employment. And a sustainable agriculture will also be good for the climate, and it can also reduce the distress migration towards urban areas. Okay. Now, in the first cycle, the focus will be on MSME and agriculture, and then neutral ecosystem body for global engagement. So there's not going to be a system which is biased towards the government or the private sector, it is going to have members from both the government as well as private sector, just like the model that we use for UPI, right? NPCI. Right, so this is like you can take a look into the structural bottlenecks in terms of the DPIs. So again, this can also be considered as the bottlenecks regarding e-governance, okay? So the same kind of approach will be required here as well. For example, cost of trust. So there's trust issues because earlier people would not involve in e-banking because they were not very sure whether they would be getting money back or not. Then language barriers, always a major problem. Then data is often fragmented, it is not combined together. Then lack of market access, cost of transactions can be very high, and knowledge and capacity gaps, especially with respect to basic operations of the tools. Then the strategic unlocks, we have discussed how can we improve this whole system through unlocking data by, for example, MSMEs, right? So if they want to get loans, one approach is that they need to provide a paper trail. They need to document the kind of services that they have or the kind of financial transaction that they are going. But imagine there's a street vendor who doesn't have any physical trail of the kind of interactions that they are having in terms of business relation. So what they can show is the background or the payment history of their UPI transaction. That can also serve as as a replacement for providing digital services such as loans, right? So this can lead to, it can expand digital transaction, it can enhance human capacity, and it can also democratize the AI. So in terms of the sectoral transformation, we have already discussed the 8 sectors. So here we need to know, we need to expand the MSMEs, we need to use MSME for finding local talent, we need to improve the livelihood for the small farmers and decentralized energy market, access to credit for 1 billion Indians. So again, universal health coverage. So every major development with respect to 8 sectors, all these are part of the sectoral transformation. So what kind of transformation do we want to achieve because of DPI 2.0? Now let's talk about what the report has talked about in terms of DPI. So it has used a very jargonized way of explaining the concept of DPI, which is, it is a design approach to enable non-linear socioeconomic transformation, so socioeconomic development at scale by leveraging technology and market innovation, right? So DPI essentially is a design approach. So which basically means that it is not simply about a software project, it is about a design, and the design is essentially user-centric, and it is to solve problem at scale, to enable non-linear socioeconomic development. So socioeconomic development, we generally think is a linear thing, right? For example, we provide X input of in terms of health development, and then the output is similar to that. But the approach here which Niti Aayog is suggesting is that we need some sort of exponential development, and this exponential development can happen because of DPI, because DPI will provide us with so much opportunities which can be leveraged by the people at large, and it will be facilitated by AI and market innovation. Then what are the key impacts of DPI? DPI as of now contributes around 1% of GDP. In 2022, it was around 0.9%. Now it is projected to be around 4.2% by 2030. Then what are the new sectors that it is going to unlock? MSMEs registered under GST grew to 1.5 crore in December 2025 from 5 lakhs. You can see how much progress it has done. From 5 lakh to 1.5 crore is a huge growth. Financial inclusion, India has achieved 80% bank account penetration. In 8 years, a feed bank for BIS estimated would have taken 47 years. So again, here you can see that this development is not a scalar approach. It is a non-linear growth, right? So this is the impact of DPI. Then hockey stick approach or effect. So what is hockey stick effect? explosion of new services previously unimaginable, providing rapidly accelerating growth following the hockey stick curve. Such, for example, this kind of growth can be provided. Okay, so because earlier there was not new services that was imagined, but because of the DPIs, new services can be unlocked, and this can create a huge return on investment and a huge chances of economic growth. So this is about DPI report. The third news is about inland waterways serve as an active instruments of growth. And this is part of GS paper 3 economy, again part of infrastructure, connectivity projects, etc. And this was in news because recently some of the important measures related to inland waterways was published in PIB, right? So let us first understand what are inland waterways, what are their status presently, why they are significant, and what are the measures that the government has adopted to promote the inland waterways in India. So first of all, what are inland waterways? Inland waterways are navigable water channels. Navigables means that you can travel within them, right? And these can be either river, they can be canals, they can be lakes, lagoons, or estuaries. So they should be navigable. Secondly, they should be within the country and they should not be part of sea. So this is the idea behind of the inland waterways. Now, what are their benefits? First, they can carry a significant cargo, more cargo compared to what can be carried in land. Secondly, they are very beneficial environmental way. So they are environmental friendly, they can carry more loads. Then they also reduce congestion, and they are also very efficient. They are time sensitive as well. So because of this reason, they have become very important. Now, in terms of their status, there is National Waterways Act 2016, which has declared 111 inland waterways as national waterway. Just like we have national highways, we also have national waterways as well. And the total strength of the national waterways is 20,187 kilometers. Then, as of March 2026, the 32 national waterways are operational, and for the rest of them, some development is being done. Then Union Budget 2026-27 announced operationalization of 20 new national waterway over the next 5 years. So again, it will be around 50 plus. Now, in terms of the cargo transportation, the cargo share has now increased over 145.84 million metric tons, and the target is to raise the inland water transport model share from 2% to that of to 5%, and export cargo volumes to more than 200 MMT by 2030 and 500 MMT by 2047, as per the Amrit Kal Maritime Amrit Kal vision. So we have a Maritime Amrit Kal vision where we have a target for inland water capacity and its contribution in the model in terms of the modal share, right? So modal share is from 2% to 5%. Now, significance we have already discussed. Low energy use, and the extent is 3 to 6 times energy lower from road and up to 2 times lower than rail. Okay. Secondly, it is also very efficient in bulk cargo movement, where the standard inland vessel with carrying capacity of 2,000 tons can replace nearly 125 trucks. Now imagine if 125 trucks can be replaced, imagine the kind of impact it will have on the carbon emission, in terms of the congestion, in terms of the traffic accidents that happen occasionally or frequently. Economically lucrative as well, because they also have a lower operating cost than land. It uses natural routes, right? So you don't have to create an artificial route here. It requires lesser infrastructure. It decongests roads as well. It is more dependable, it is more predictable travel, devoid of traffic and space limitation. So these are some of the advantages of inland waterways. Then what measures have the government taken? So one we have already discussed is that the national waterways have been enacted in 2016, which have given 111 inland waters as national waterways. Apart from that, there's a regulating body that has been created, Inland Waterway Authority of India, that was created in 1985, and that provided for the establishment of the Inland Waterways Authority of India. Just like we have NHAI, National Highway Authority of India, which is the regulator for the road sector as part of the national highways. Now IWAI is the regulator for the inland waterways. Apart from that, we also have the National Waterways Act 2016, which has identified 111 inland rivers as national waterways. Then, apart from the legislative intervention, we have also taken certain schemes, such as the Harit Nauka Inland Vessels Green Transition Guideline, which targets 30% reduction in the carbon intensity of the inland waterway-based passenger traffic by 2030. Then, we also have Coastal Cargo Promotion Scheme, and this was announced very recently in this budget itself. The idea is to increase the combined share of the inland waterways and the coastal shipping from 6 to 12% by 2047. Then we also have Jal Marg Vikas project, which is along National Waterway 1, that is from Varanasi Haldia stretch. Then we have Jal Vahak Cargo Promotion Scheme 2024, etc. So these are some of these schemes that you can look into when it comes to inland waterways in India. So what is required is that you need to understand why it is important, what is the present status, how many inland waterways are actually working in India. Then if you look at the PIB report, you will also get some of the important national waterways which are operational. So particularly you can look into the top 5, 10 in terms of their length. That would be good. Okay. Let's talk about multilateralism in climate action. And this is part of GS paper 3 environment. And why this was in news? Because recently 17th Petersburg Climate Dialogue happened, which is a CLI informal annual summit launched by Germany. So Germany has this annual summit that it has been launching since 2010. Okay, and this was the 17th edition. What is the purpose of this? The purpose is that it is an informal summit where the different parties, different countries can come together and talk about, strategize what they are going to discuss in the conference of parties as part of the UNFCCC, that is UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this time COP31 is to happen in Turkey, right? And before that it was in Brazil. So once this happened, so it is to strengthen the multilateral cooperation for COP31, despite the geopolitical friction that is happening here. So here we need to understand not what happened in the Pittsburgh Climate Dialogue, but we need to understand the role or the significance of multilateralism in climate change as a concept. We need to understand why it is important, and we need to understand how it has made the climate justice more relevant now, and what are some of the roadblocks and what can be done to address this. So let us first take a look into the role of multilateralism in climate action. So as we all know that there are several events or several global phenomena which cannot be controlled by a single country, whether it is terrorism, whether it is loss of biodiversity, or whether it is climate change. It does not respect a single country, right? Therefore, a coordinated action has to be taken place. And this is where we need to acknowledge that climate is a global public good. It is not just limited to a sovereign nation. It is a global public good. And therefore, multilateralism is a foundational response to climate change, which is a transboundary threat. So first we need to acknowledge this fact. The second aspect that we need to acknowledge is that we need to take a collective governance, and it should be rules-based in approach, so that the powerful countries cannot dictate their agenda on the developing countries, right? So there has to be a rule-based mechanism, and that would be for sharing the responsibilities, and this would prevent the unilateral approach and ensuring a coordinated climate action. An prime example of this is nationally determined contributions. So this also provides a global rule book where countries can determine to what extent they will be curbing emission cut, and then other countries can hold them accountable as well. Thirdly, it is also acting as a negotiating platform. So different countries have uh, frameworks, like international frameworks like UNFCCC, that is UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, then UN Convention on Biodiversity, and Convention on Desertification, on combating desertification. So we have different approaches for combating different areas. So climate change, biodiversity, and combating desertification are some of the important platforms where where the experts and the policymakers, they come and they negotiate and they discuss the adaptation and the mitigation strategies. So what is mitigation? Mitigation is prevention strategies. For example, if carbon emission is to be cut by using renewable energy, that would come again in terms of mitigation strategies. And adaptation is about living with the effect of the climate change in terms of enabling some kind of infrastructure that would prevent or that would ensure that people are secure from the ill effect of climate change. Okay, then next part is very important with respect to climate justice, because it is not the responsibility of addressing climate change, and the contribution cannot be uniform, right? Because climate change has happened because of the emission of the various gases following the industrial revolution, particularly by the developed countries, right? And the developing countries are only catching up. So there cannot be a uniform approach for emission control, and that principle is embedded into the CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibilities. Now this approach is also a very important part of upholding the climate justice in terms of distributing equity by, and they institutionalize the principle of CBDR, acknowledging the varying or differing national capabilities in historical emissions. Then apart from that, there is also requirement for financing, for funding, because see, for a developing countries or least developing countries, they do not have the adequate finance to go for the mitigation and the adaptation strategies. So it is very important that the developed countries could provide financial mechanism, because ultimately if the developed countries do not help the developing or the poor countries, ultimately if the climate emission or the global warming happens, it will not be just limited to the poor or the developing countries, it will also impact the developed countries, right? So it is very essential that all the countries come together and then take a decision in this regard. Now these are some of the importance of multilateralism in climate action. But what are some of the challenges? So the first major challenge is there is the decision making paralysis, which basically means that most of these decisions are taken on the basis of consensus, which means that the smaller countries as well as the developed countries, they are considered on level or equal footing. So a decision cannot be taken up unless all the members agree to it. Okay, and any member which does not accept the decision can block the entire implementation mechanism. So this often leads to paralysis of various development, right? So this is a major roadblock, especially with respect to UNFCCC. The second major approach or challenge is financial constraint. So the developed countries have promised to provide $100 billion aid to the developing countries, right? But the problem is even the developed countries are facing financial issues, and there's a huge problem in terms of their financial fiscal status as well, and there's a pressure on them to not commit to such policies. So they have failed to mobilize the promised 100 billion annually, and this pressure has led to problems of mitigation and adaptation strategies of the developing countries. Thirdly, there is geopolitical fragmentation because of rising unilateralism, which means that the powerful countries are quietly moving away from such arrangements, and this undermines the stability and the continuity of the international climate law and the climate justice. So for example, US has already withdrawn from several climate bodies and commitments. Then there is other issues such as asymmetric agenda favoring the developing nations. For example, you may have heard about the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, this is not directly linked to climate change, but in a way that demotivates the developing countries, or in a way it does not protect the developing countries from the exigencies of this law, because without the funding mechanism, they would also not be able to let go or go for a green transition. Then there is technology restriction with respect to technology transfer, etc. So these are some of the challenges. Now, what can be done in this regard? The first approach is we definitely need to reform multilateralism. We need to strengthen it. Something with respect to the existing platforms can be done. For example, maybe in terms of, or in place of the consensus orientation, maybe we can have a special majority concept or something of that sort. Secondly, we need to promote issue-based coalition, a mini-lateral kind of coalition, just like we have promoted International Solar Alliance, things like that. Then ensure climate finance, and for this we need to reform the multi-development banks such as World Bank to scale up the concessional finance, establish accountability mechanism for developed countries funding commitment. Third, de-risk clean technology transfer to the global south, which basically means that we need to leverage the public-private platforms, partnership models to scale innovation, share risk, and enable affordable access. Then we need to prioritize community-owned nature-based solutions instead of corporate solution, empower local communities and indigenous people through local governance, knowledge, and finance. So this can be considered as some of the solutions that we can provide here. We can also talk about some of the initiatives taken under Indian leadership, or we can talk about some of the local level adaptation mechanism. For example, Tamil Nadu village level committees, which have been formed as part of the adaptation strategies, right? So this can be considered as some of the major way forward with respect to ensuring that climate justice is not just limited to letter, but it can be implemented in spirit as well. Fine, so this is all about the main news. Let's now discuss the quick updates. So very quickly, first is about SHP, that is Small Hydropower Development Scheme. And this was recently mentioned in the PIB report. And this was about the SHP development scheme is about harnessing the unique strengths of the small hydropower. So this is a scheme. So what exactly is the tenure of the scheme? It is from FY 26-27 to 2030-31. Objective is to support the small hydropower project. Now understand that the small hydropower project means that their capacity is from 1 to 25 megawatt. Secondly, another important distinction that you should note is that the small hydropower projects are within Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. But if the power projects are of a higher magnitude, for example, more than 25 megawatt, they would be under Ministry of Power. So again, remember this distinction. Then what is the potential of India with respect to SHP? So as of now, total of 21,133.61 megawatt, of which 24.7% have been harnessed. Then the target is to unlock 1,500 megawatt of new SHP capacity. Then what exactly is going to be the contour of this project? So financial assistance will be given to the northeastern states and international border district up to 3.6 crore per megawatt, or 30% of the project cost. And the cap is 30 crore per project. Now this is going to be very instrumental, because then this will be part of India's Act East policy, and this will be bringing inclusive growth to different places of our country. Then for other locations, it will be 2.4 crore per megawatt, or 20% of the project cost. And cap is 20 crore per project. Again, numbers are not important, but you should know that this project has a huge transformative impact on the mountainous territory and also in the northeastern regions. Second news is with respect to index of service production. And this is important because the MOSPI, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, has released an approach paper to compilation of ISP. And this is important because we have an index of industrial production, which basically measures the change or tracks the manufacturing sector, right? We do not have any index to track the service changes or movement in the services sector. And also important because in India, the majority of the GDP is contributed by the service sector, but we do not have any such index to measure to what extent the service sector is moving. So perhaps there's a need for us to have an index of industrial services as well, right? So what are the proposed ISP details? The base year is supposed to be 24-25. Then data source is GST data, administrative data from sectoral ministries, and the annual survey of incorporated services sector enterprise. Coverage, the index is largely covering the formal sector because the data is largely available, and including the subsectors like wholesale and retail trade, transport, banking, insurance, real estate, communication, etc. So all of them are part of services and they're largely part of the formal sector. Next news is about Global Network Against Food Crisis. Now this body has released its report on report on food crisis, and as per this report, around 266 million people in 47 countries face high levels of acute food insecurity in 2025. And more importantly, what they have observed is now that conflict has overtaken extreme weather as the main driver of extreme hunger. So earlier, extreme hunger was largely driven by extreme weather events such as drought, such as famine, etc. But now conflict in several areas, whether it is in West Asia or in Africa, they are driving major hunger. Now, what about Global Network Against Food Crisis? So it was launched in 2016 by the Food and Agricultural Organization with European Union and WFP, that is World Food Programme, at World Humanitarian Summit. The purpose is that it is a multi-stakeholder initiative of humanitarian and development actors united by commitments to tackle the root causes of food crisis and to promote sustainable solution. So again, there can be a brief question on prelims as well with respect to which countries are facing acute food crisis, right? So because UPSC has in the past asked questions along the same line. Then conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, and this is being hosted by Colombia and Netherlands. They are hosting the first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels in Santa Marta, that is in Colombia. Now, what is the conference all about? The conference was officially announced during COP30. COP is Conference of Party 30, as sustained political platform to deliver what is called as implementation-driven action towards an orderly phase out of fossil fuel. So basically, it is about how should we take action which is to drive out the fossil fuel, and how do we involve different stakeholders. So it is not a negotiating body, but nor constitute part of any formal negotiation. It also does not intend to replace the UNFCCC. So what exactly it intends to do? It is just proposing something, right? So it launched the Science Panel for the Global Energy Transition, which helps country and sector level milestone aligned with returning global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So long story short, this just proposes how do we transition towards non-fossil fuel based source of energy. So how do we transition towards the greener sources? Then another very important news is Worli Khandar excavation. So there's an ongoing megalith excavation at Worli Khandar, right? And this is led by Dr. Prabhash Sahu, and it is done where? In Maharashtra's Vidarbha district. It has revealed certain distinctive burials architecture and the kind of funeral practices, okay? And it has also suggested different ways where the pots were hanging from upside downs, right? So it can come across as a watershed moment in our understanding of the megalith cultures, okay? So the preliminary observation suggests that at least it is 2,500 years old, and it can be placed in the Iron Age megalithic period of India. So what exactly are some of the important details? First is that the site uniquely features stone circles. You can see here, these are the stone circles enclosing menhirs. So menhirs are just upright standing stones, right? So it has this circles plus it has menhirs, and it combines two distinct burial styles. You can see here the burial styles are very distinct. The potteries are inverted, which means that the potteries are like this, a rare cluster of 50 pots deliberately arranged upside down. Again, what exactly it signifies, we are yet to know, but more information is awaited in this regard. Then, what are the grave goods? Excavation has yielded copper necklaces, iron implements, etched carnelian beads, and fragmentary bones remains in this part. Geophagy. So scientists have discovered a very interesting phenomena where a monkey was eating uh, mud. Okay, so that was not exactly a monkey, but it was a Barbary macaque that was in Gibraltar. That is only wild primates that is found in Europe, right? And it was practicing geophagy, that is eating soil. Now, this was a very surprising thing, and it is also part of it has also become a lot of memes as well, right? So we need to understand what exactly is this phenomena, geophagy. So geophagy, basically geo means earth and phagy means to eat. Okay, so it is defined as the voluntary and continuous ingestion, means eating, of earthy material, means soil. So when you eat soil, babies also eat soil sometimes. So this is called as geophagy, including rocks, soils, and clays, noticed by both or practiced by both humans and animals. And why do they do this? Is it because of the taste or is it because of something else? Perhaps the reason is because of nutrient supplementation, relief from intestinal disorders, and cultural beliefs. See, it is basically what happened was that in the Gibraltar area, these macaques were or are often a tourist site, right? And they are often given certain junk foods to eat. Now they are not able to ingest that junk food, and because to has an for a respite, they have been eating soil, and this is why this practice has become very important in news, right? So it is prevalent in commonly seen with children, and often pregnant women in certain areas also crave soil, right? Because they need certain bacteria for to help them with ingesting certain things. Okay, so this phenomena is called as geophagy. Next is typhoid. So there was a recent report in the Hindu, and this report was about analysis in Lancet report that talked about, despite taking several measures in India, typhoid remains a very prominent, or it remains in India, right? So what exactly is the reason why India continues to have the burden of typhoid, along with growing presence of the multi-drug resistant nature and XDR strains? So for this, the major reasons that were identified is because we are now consuming typhoid, or there is an antimicrobial resistance because of the over-the-counter uh, availability of these antibiotics. Secondly, there is also prevalence of water and food contamination, right? So because of such reasons, this is again creating a lot of challenge for us to eliminate typhoid. So what exactly is typhoid? It is caused by a bacterium called Bacterium Salmonella typhi. It lives only in humans. Now persons with typhoid fever carry the bacteria in their bloodstream and intestinal tract. The transmission is primarily through contaminated food and drinking water. So therefore, if you undertake contaminated or polluted food or water, then the chances of you developing typhoid becomes very high. Symptoms are prolonged high fever, fatigue, headache, nausea, abdominal pain, and constipation or diarrhea. Typhoid conjugate vaccines are used in immunization. So for us, from the perspective of health governance, what is important for us to understand is why, despite so much interventions, this continues to be prevalent in India. Next news is about sacrifice ratio. So sacrifice ratio is essentially related to inflation control. So when countries control inflation, okay, so it requires to the countries have to lower or increase the interest rate, and because of that increasing interest rate, sometimes it can come at the cost of the GDP growth. And this whole approach is called as sacrifice ratio, because to mitigate inflation, what is the extent of GDP that you are able to sacrifice? Okay, so this measures of inflation control was seen in US, UK, and India. That highlighted economic cost of managing inflation, and it is measured using sacrifice ratio. So what is sacrifice ratio? It measures the direct economic cost of bringing down inflation, and it represents the exact percent of real GDP lost for every 1% decrease in the inflation rate. For example, if the sacrifice ratio is 3, which means that the GDP that has been lost by to reduce 1% decrease in inflation rate is 3%, right? Then the metric highlights the strict trade-off between ensuring price stability and sustaining economic growth. The higher ratio means fighting inflation causes significant short-term pain, including increased unemployment and reduced industrial production. So for all practical purposes, we need to keep the sacrifice ratio as less as possible. Then the SIPRI trends in the world military expenditure. And SIPRI has released the expenditure on the defense by different countries, and it has placed India under the 5th position after US, Russia, China, Russia, Germany. So India is at the 5th position, right? And India and these 5 countries account for 58% of the global defense spending. So India is the 5th biggest spender, that is the 3.2% of global expenditure in the world, with total expenditure of $92 billion. And in contrast, China contributes more than $300 billion, and Pakistan contributes roughly around $12 billion. Okay. So India's spending has saw an upsurge of 8.9% compared to the previous year. Right, what is SIPRI? SIPRI is an independent international institution dedicated to research into conflict, arms control, and disarmament. It has been established in 1996 in Sweden. So this is all about news today. I hope this was useful. Thank you and all the best.